JustLiberty.org. It's good for you and it's good for me. JustLiberty.org. JustLiberty.org.
Hi, this is Amanda Marzullo. The Blanco, Texas Police Department recently issued a Facebook post asking criminals to please refrain from crime until the temperatures go down. Scott, what do you think of this?
I'm trying to do my part, man. My own criminal activity declined significantly in the summertime heat, probably 80% or so, I'd say. For one thing, it's harder to drive a getaway car with potholders on your hands.
Yeah, I mean, that's rough.
It's rough. But people say we don't have seasons in Texas, but we really do. And those seasons are tolerable, hot, really hot, and oh my God, you've got to be fucking kidding me.
Except they're not.
Which is where we are right now.
Yeah.
Yes, that's this moment.
Yes, it is bad.
Hello, boys and girls, and welcome to the August 2019 episode of Just Liberty's Reasonably Suspicious podcast covering Texas criminal justice, politics, and policy. As always, I'm here today with our good friend Amanda Marzullo, who's Executive Director of the Texas Defender Service. How are you doing today, Mandy?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
Really well, and we've got a fine show today featuring Texas Monthly's Michael Hall discussing Texas' latest high-profile exoneration, this time spearheaded by an investigative podcast. Mike is also a well-known professional guitarist in Austin and stuck around to record a segment ranking the best American prison songs. Mandy, what are you looking forward to talking about on the podcast today?
Well, I'm not looking forward to talking this time around. I'm looking forward to listening to your conversation with Michael Hall about the best American prison songs.
Me too. I've really been enjoying all the prep for that, so I can't wait for that part. First up, in our top story, more Texas district attorneys have announced they won't prosecute marijuana cases after the legislature changed the law to legalize hemp with low THC levels. Now, prosecutors must prove someone could actually get high on a substance before they can be prosecuted for possessing it. But Texas crime labs still don't have a way to test marijuana for its THC content, a fact the legislative committee was told before the law passed, and equipment to do so cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So prosecutors are caught in the lurch. That's why in Tarrant, Dallas, Bexar, Williamson, Fort Bend, and Nueces counties, district attorneys have decided to dismiss pod cases for the time being. Texas DPS will now issue tickets instead of arresting people, but Harris County will continue to send people caught with marijuana through a pretrial diversion program. And some counties, like Lubbock and El Paso, have announced they will continue business as usual. The media hasn't covered what most of Texas' 254 counties are doing, so there's still a lot of unknown here. Mandy, now that we've seen counties taking all these various approaches, what's your opinion about this mess, and what does it say to you about both the drug war and Texas legislative process?
I think the first thing that comes to mind with all of this is how important the legislative fact-finding process is, and that in this case, because it was in the agriculture committee,
That's right, agriculture.
The agriculture committee, you had a lot of criminal justice stakeholders not showing up to the hearings on this.
Right. I certainly wasn't aware of this issue until it was already something that had happened.
Yeah, no, and definitely. And so I think if the DAs from each of these jurisdictions had shown up at the hearing and said, this will be a problem, we won't be able to prosecute it, I think that it would have probably caused more caution on the part of the lawmakers pushing this bill through. That's
certainly true, although I did go back and watch the portion of that hearing where Brady Mills from the Department of Public Safety told them this was going to happen. I mean, maybe it was a little technical, but he did tell them. I mean, it really seemed to me once I heard what he said, gosh, surprising somebody didn't pick up on it. But you're right. Being in the Agriculture Committee, the stakeholders all being off somewhere else, that is what explains it. It emphasized to me how important those committee hearings are. That somebody really needs to be paying attention to what's said at those, because that's where the problems with your legislation crop up.
And also issue expertise.
That's right.
But in a lot of ways, this bill, I think, went through the wrong committee. It went through the most politically expedient committee, but it didn't go through the committee where they know the stakeholders. Like you and I know Brady. We know
right.
that he doesn't come forward and raise issues unless they're real.
He's not a demagogue. He's not saying it just to say it. If he says he's going to have a problem, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. And for me, it emphasized how important that fact-finding process is. We're at a point in time when in the Senate, for example, the Senate Criminal Justice Committee has almost no fact-finding in its committee hearings any longer. Chairman Whitmire just actively dissuades people from testifying and doesn't want them to give testimony. And so things go through really with no expert analysis given to them at all. And here's an example where the expert analysis was given and they just weren't listening, or no one had the understanding of what they were hearing to latch onto it.
And I really think it's the latter, right? Because part of the other problem that you deal with the legislative process is that there are always going to be people who show up telling lawmakers that if they pass a particular bill, that the sky will fall.
Right.
And
right.
so, if it was, in this instance, it was just one person, even though he's someone who's very credible, him alone in the wrong committee.
Maybe that's not enough, right?
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that I took away from this, and maybe this is because we mentioned all the heat in the intro, and I was on vacation recently in Canada to get away from said heat. And I have to admit, I had not realized until we got up to Canada that they legalized marijuana last year nationally. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, it's just a legal thing now. And I went a couple of times into the dispensaries there in Montreal and Quebec City, and it really was remarkable. It was an incredibly bustling business, frankly. People from every walk of life. It was grandma next to the biker, next to the Haitian day worker, next to the business person, you name it, all there in line to get their smoke. We were there for this circus festival in Montreal. Yeah. Well, there was less marijuana being smoked at that circus festival than any Auditorium Shores concert here in Austin. Not even close. Yeah, it's not the case that it just let some floodgates through and all of a sudden everyone's smoking out at the elementary school or something. I mean, maybe it's that Canadians can make anything boring, but boy, did they make that boring. They legalized pot, and it's just something that everyone goes and gets and smokes, and it's not a big deal. And it makes you wonder, what are we doing? We're going to buy 30 of these $500,000 machines so we can test whether the pot's at 0.3%. And does anyone really care that much? Honestly, the polling says no. And in Canada, when they just went ahead and legalized it, it's fine. It's just fine. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram had an interesting article, an editorial, where they said that this should be treated as a natural experiment, that the DA should just stop prosecuting, and we should just see whether, when you decriminalize, does the sky fall? And it's not going to. Canada shows us that. Colorado shows us that. All these other states.
Yeah.
It's just okay. This is all much ado about nothing.
I agree with that. Next up, Scott interviews Texas Monthly's Michael Hall about an amazing innocence case out of Smith County in East Texas. Ed Ates was falsely convicted of murder a quarter of a century ago, and it took a true crime podcaster crowdsourcing an investigation to get him out and prove his innocence. Let's hear Mike tell the story.
All right, Mike, thank you for sitting down to talk to me about your latest and greatest Texas innocence story. This is a story about Ed Ates from out of Smith County. Is that right?
Yep. Tyler, Texas.
Well, and I have to say, I really had to wonder as I read this, having you partnered with Pam Koloff for so many years at Texas Monthly, and is it really an innocence case if it has fewer than 22,000 words in the story that tells it? I feel like you've short shrifted us here that
I think this was only 9,000, right? Or 10,000.
exactly.
So, yeah,
So I feel like there's another 10 or 15 left before you've really had the story completely done. But hey, that
there's always a lot more than you think on the cutting room floor. But in an innocence case, that's especially true.
no, I'm sure it is. I'm teasing. It's an excellent story, and everyone should check it out. So tell us about Ed Ates. It's another false conviction. I had a journalist tell me recently that she had trouble pitching false conviction stories because the public already knows how it ends. But this even has some twists and turns that are unusual for these innocence cases. So what made you gravitate to this story?
This story, it really is a great story about a guy wrongfully convicted, Ed Ates, who is, I think he's 51 now.
Wow.
And he spent 20 years in prison for a murder that he absolutely did not do. What made this story so interesting is that Ed would still be in prison today if it hadn't been for a podcaster up in rural Michigan finding out about his case. And that to me was just mind-blowing, that it was almost an accident. Well, it is an accident that Ed Ates is free today.
Right. The name of the podcast again?
The name of the podcast is Truth and Justice.
Right.
And it's a guy named Bob Ruff. And Bob was, a few years ago, was a fireman in a little rural community in southwestern Michigan. And he got completely obsessed with cereal, like a lot of people did. Started his own podcast as like a book club for cereal. Got a lot of listeners, more than 100,000 listeners. And then at a certain point decided, I want to do this full time. Quit his job as a fireman and started looking for an actual case to do, and put out feelers, asked people to send in cases. And a young woman said her uncle was down in Texas for something he didn't, armed robbery that he did not commit. So Bob Ruff started looking into the case. And at a certain point, he kind of peeled off from it. The guy's name was Kenny Snow. And he started to think, well, I mean, Kenny had actually pled guilty to something. But Kenny had told him, I lied on a guy named Ed Ates, and that helped send him to prison for life for a murder. He said, I don't know if he committed it or not, but I lied on him. So Bob looks into that, and it turns out that Kenny Snow was a jailhouse snitch who was brought in to testify against Ed Ates. And Ed had already gone through one trial, which had ended in a mistrial. The prosecutors brought him in for a second trial, and that did the trick. Sent him away for 99 years.
Wow. And was there any corroborating evidence at all to the snitch testimony?
Oh, it was just ridiculous. The corroborating evidence was so-called human feces on the bottom of a shoe, which was never proven to be human feces. And it was just a splotch on the bottom of a shoe that the deputies said was feces, and the prosecution said in trial was feces, even though they never had any evidence that it really was human feces. And the defense attorneys didn't object enough. So the jury basically thought that there was human feces on the bottom of Ed's shoe, which would have matched the human feces at the bottom on the kitchen floor of the deceased's trailer, even though
we're matching human feces that may not actually even be human feces.
They never did a test. They never did the forensic testing to prove this was human feces, either on the floor of this dead woman's trailer or on the bottom of a shoe. But the combination of the feces and the snitch sent this guy who was Ed, who was 30 years old, had just married, had one kid, one baby, and another on the way, to prison for 99 years.
That's insane.
And so at a certain point, I mean, this is in the late 90s this happened. At a certain point, a few years ago, Bob gets this case, and he starts looking into it, and he starts coming down to Tyler. And not only does he come down, but he starts asking his listeners to help him out. And so his listeners are all over the country, but he has a lot of listeners up in Northeast Texas. And they start doing things like he has to find out who has a phone number, a Kilgore phone number, and he can't find it online. So he gets somebody in Kilgore to go out to the library in Kilgore, the city library, and look up this phone number. He gets these people, these amateur serologists, he has a Facebook page, a fan page, and all these people go on there and they start giving their serology ideas on blood and feces, on how to find out whether this was really feces on the bottom of Ed's shoe. He starts getting all these people to basically chime in and help him do this investigation, while he's also coming down to Smith County, and he brings a scanner down and scans every single page of the court documents. He does all this work on his own because he's convinced that Ed Ates is innocent.
Wow, that Smith County DA mafia must have loved that.
He was Bob was not a popular guy in Smith County.
Wow. Well, thank God for Bob Ruff. That's amazing.
I mean, he eventually he's going on the air every week on his podcast, and by now he's got like 150,000 listeners, and they're printing up T-shirts. Ed Ates is innocent. Free Ed Ates.
Wow.
And he eventually interests the Innocence Project of Texas, who one of the reasons they get so interested is Bob and his
have done all the work.
Have done all the work.
Yeah.
So they, Allison Clayton and the Innocence Project start working on this. They bring in a parole attorney, and the parole attorney goes before the parole board, and in amazing lightning fashion, they get Ed paroled.
You know, I worked at the Innocence Project of Texas as their policy director for 7 or 8 years. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize about that work is that the volume of investigation that's required to actually prove to the standard the Court of Criminal Appeals requires innocence is staggering. And the Innocence Project of Texas is a small nonprofit, and they don't have the resources to do that sort of work, honestly, on more than a tiny, tiny handful of cases, if that. And the ones that really rise to the fore, and I say this just because there are people out there who are desperate and have cases and want to know, what do? You kind of got to do the bulk of it yourself. Someone has to just take ownership and say, okay, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a private investigator, but no one's going to do it unless I do it, and just start. And eventually, if you find evidence of innocence, then you'll start to find allies. But somebody has to just start. And just asking an attorney, oh, can you look into this, really is kind of wasting everyone's time. So doing it through a media project where you're crowdsourcing is kind of an amazing thing. At the same time, I have seen family members do exactly the same thing and show up with a massive file, on their loved one's case. And let me tell you, it goes to the top of the pile when that happens. So this is unusual being a media outlet, but I think it's actually kind of typical about how a lot of these innocence cases happen. Some family member, a wife, a parent, somebody, just keeps digging, just won't let go.
And as a journalist, I mean, I'm the same way. If a family member or a family or some kind of crew also believes in this woman's innocence and has done a bunch of work, that makes me a lot more interested in the case, because it's not just one person. I mean, as journalists, we get letters every day from inmates.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure some of them have great valid claims, but some of them don't. But how do you tell? Well, one of the ways you tell is when you get a bunch of people saying, oh yeah, this is a great case.
Right. So I guess the other thing about this case, and I will caveat this by saying up front, Smith County is my home county. I grew up in Tyler. What in the hell is wrong with Smith County? Oh my God. Why do we just keep doing this over and over and over? You start. Just talk about what a crap hole the Smith County justice system is, and why we just have these innocence cases cropping up from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And it's the same crew of people over and over who are involved in these cases.
Well, I think,
oh my God.
I think that's a good place to start. It's the same crew. You go to a lot of counties and there was a change. Remember in Dallas County when all of a sudden the DA was elected and it was a black guy.
Craig Watkins.
Watkins. And all of a sudden Dallas County changed completely.
That's right.
He
wasn't perfect, but being different severed the ties to the old school.
In San Antonio, in Houston, I mean, in Austin, In big cities, there are changes. In Smith County, it's been basically the same crew that has been running Smith County for 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
The same judges keep getting elected. It's been basically the same crew of district people in the district attorney's office. And so you don't get a whole lot of change. And I mean, when Craig Watkins came in, he had this idea. Yeah, I mean, and with that idea, we already knew there were some exonerations, but he went out and he found a bunch more. Smith County has only had one DNA exoneration in all this time, A.B. Butler. And they don't have that same kind of, since they're not bringing in new people all the time who have new ideas and who have an understanding that the system makes mistakes. They don't bring that in. So basically in Smith County, I think they still believe that the system works really, really well.
Right.
And so you don't have this kind of sense that, well, maybe we made some really bad mistakes here and we should do something about it. And I think, I mean, it's a law and order community going way back, but I mean, a lot of places are law and order community. Dallas was a law and order community going way back, but there was change in Dallas County. There hasn't been any change in Smith County. There's no sense up there that there might be something wrong and that we should look at this and maybe do something about it. You know, there is a sense, and these are all, I mean, from everything I've heard about Jack Skeen, he is a great person. He is a decent Christian man. He's a good father. He's a good friend. I mean, I've talked to people up there who are defense attorneys who can't stand the stuff he's done, but they're all like, I love Jack Skeen. He's a good man. It's something about the system that they have built that is so impervious to reflection, to any kind of second guessing that leads to these things. They've been happening for years now. And just, again, purely by chance has this one been fixed. Purely by chance is Ed Ates home with his family.
Right. I mean, that to me is, I guess, to put a pin on it, the most extraordinary thing about this case is that all of the things that caused Ed Ates to be falsely convicted are common as dirt. And all of the things that caused him to be liberated are the most extravagantly unusual. If you wrote it in a novel, people wouldn't believe it.
No, it's ridiculous. A podcaster from a small town in southwestern Michigan? Are you kidding me?
That's right. Who goes pro and then gets some guy in Texas out of it's unbelievable. So literally, if you saw it in a movie, you'd say, "Yeah, not believable. I'm not going to buy it." So anyway, well, thank you.
And real quick, it wasn't just Bob. It was also Ed's wife. Kim had a lot to do with getting him out. It wasn't just Bob Ruff, but
she stuck with him 2 decades.
Stuck with him for 2 decades. He was the father of her 2 children. She brought him to prison. She, even when Ed tried to push her away, saying, "Get on with your life," she believed in his innocence so much that she stayed with him. And when Ed finally came home, it was one of the most joyous reunions I or the crowd of 50 people outside the Walls unit had ever seen.
That is an amazing love story. That's astonishing. All right. Well, thank you very much for sitting down and talking with me, Mike. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you, Scott.
Now Scott continues his conversation with Texas Monthly's Michael Hall, this time taking on the task of ranking the greatest American prison songs. Michael is a longtime musician in Austin, most notably playing guitar for the Wild Seeds, and has written on musical topics for Texas Monthly for many years. Here's what he and Scott had to say about how the greatest American prison songs stack up.
All right, I'm here with Mike Hall, executive editor at Texas Monthly, and we're here to talk about the greatest ever prison songs. Mike, thank you for joining me.
Glad to be here, Scott. I love talking about prison songs.
Excellent. Mike, just to establish your bona fides, is the longtime guitarist for the Wild Seeds here in Austin, in addition to being one of the best reporters on criminal justice topics in the state, and so I think is uniquely qualified. And I, by contrast, am probably not.
I think being the observer that you are and the music fan you are, you have plenty of bona fides.
Well, let's find out. We're here to talk about the greatest, let's say greatest American prison songs, because it did occur to me as soon as I started thinking of this, there's probably a lot of narco corridos that are badass that we just are not qualified to latch on to.
Absolutely.
And some of their prison songs are simply amazing. But American prison songs, I think most people think that country and Western music is just full of them. I was a little bit surprised when I began doing a little bit of research. That isn't entirely true. It's sort of a specialty of a few.
Sure.
Tell me, what do you think are sort of before we start talking about the songs, what are the qualifications? What should the qualifications be for the greatest American prison songs?
That's a tough one, because one of the things that I love about some of these songs is a certain level of authenticity, that the people who are singing it were actually in prison. Some of these songs, you can at least imagine that you can hear the pain and the heartache in their voices, which is great. But on the other hand, there are some great prison songs by people who did not do time in prison, but still evoke what the listener might think of as the feeling of being in prison. So to me, it's and there's plenty of points in between.
Right. Right.
And
There's
there
that
are a
great
lot of
scene in that Johnny Cash biopic where his father says, well, everyone's going to think you've been to prison if you keep singing these songs.
Exactly. But Johnny Cash went out of his way to sing to prisoners and had this kind this connection with them.
He earned it in other ways.
He'd been in jail. I don't think he'd ever been in prison.
That's right.
But so he's kind of in that kind of area in between. Merle Haggard. Didn't he?
Merle Haggard was in prison.
He was actually in prison.
Merle Haggard saw Johnny Cash perform in prison, and there's a great story he tells where he finally got to meet Johnny Cash as a performer, and he said, "By the way, I heard you when you played at whatever the prison was," and Johnny said, "Well, Merle, I don't think you were there. That was so and so who opened for me." He said, "No, I was in the audience." Wow, that was
yeah. But Merle has a couple of prison songs that, I don't know, when you know that about him, that just makes them that more meaningful, I guess.
Right. Well, I put together a long list. I was way too lazy to cut it all down like you did, but I put in a top 30, and I think Merle had 3 of them.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And I think you're right, authenticity, but at the same time, some of these were just so popular and made such an impact. Yeah.
Well, I think people really respond to the whole idea of being in prison. And there's something about, look at the Shawshank Redemption, that movie, which is kind of a typical Hollywood movie, but every time it's on, I'll watch it.
Right.
There's something about that. There's something about prisoners and prison that everybody can identify with and relate to, whether it's a wrongful conviction or just somebody who made a mistake. And a good prison song tugs at those emotional heartstrings.
Tell me about your greatest hits list. Who should be on our top 5?
All right, let me start with number 1, because this to me is just one of my favorites. It's a Texas song, and it's got plenty of authenticity, and it's "Ain't No More Cane on the Brazos," which was a song that was first recorded back in, I believe, 1933 by John Lomax of some prisoners in a Texas prison. And it's just an amazing song that they used to sing when they were out doing the work in the fields in this prison just off the Brazos River. I don't know if he recorded it at the prison or after they had gotten out, but this is a song by prisoners about what they would do during the day while they're cutting down sugarcane.
Well, Lomax actually was recording in prisons. I actually didn't know until you mentioned this that he'd recorded in Texas prisons. His most famous ones were in Louisiana. Yeah. And another person who I think is on both of our lists, Leadbelly.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, his famous recording of Midnight Special with Lomax was actually done in Angola prison. But
so his first one was done actually in prison. The first time he did that song.
Well, here's the story if you haven't heard it about Leadbelly and Midnight Special, because it's amazing. Leadbelly says that he wrote this song when he was in prison in Texas nearly 20 years earlier.
At Sugarland.
That's right, at Sugarland. And Governor Pat Neff was coming to the Central Unit in Sugarland, and Leadbelly played his version of Midnight Special for him, including that wonderful last verse, "If you're ever in Houston, you better walk right," and naming the sheriff
gamble.
and
Better not fight.
That's right. Naming the sheriff and calling him out, and Neff ended up pardoning Leadbelly over this. Well, Leadbelly ended up committing another murder and going to prison in Louisiana, and that's where Lomax found him and recorded him in the 1930s.
Yeah.
And then when Leadbelly got out, he went on to record like 50 other blues songs, and some of those are some of the only examples we have of 19th century work, of some particular 19th century work songs, came from Leadbelly in particular, but Lomax, many, many more of them. That was like a really, and then we were also talking earlier about Pete Seeger doing the same thing in the 50s and going in. I know he went into Texas prisons, and there's some amazing Texas prison work songs that didn't make my list, but probably should. They're unbelievable. Yeah. These guys, he's recording them chopping down trees with axes, and you can hear the thump of the tree in between the chants. It's unbelievable. Yeah. But I'm getting off track here. So we got Midnight Special.
Midnight Special is definitely on my list. I love "I Shall Be Released," the Bob Dylan song. I just
don't want to hear him sing it.
I like his version of it, but the version that I love the most is Nina Simone's. She actually changes the chord structure a little bit, and it's makes it even more there's even more longing in the song, and then the way, of course, she sings it.
Right. It's amazing. I was joking.
Just phenomenal. I mean, I love hearing Dylan sing, but Nina Simone kind of takes it to a different level.
Right. Right. Well, and Dylan's voice he almost, the way he sings is almost designed to strip away. Okay, just listen to what I'm saying. Don't focus on the musicality. It's there, but focus on the message here.
Yeah.
And she's so musical, and the musicality just oozes from everything she does. But all of the meaning really is deepened in her version. So I think you're dead on about the right version of that song.
A kind of obvious one, but that doesn't make it any less perfect, is "Folsom Prison Blues" by Johnny Cash, which I love it. I love the whole structure of the song, the guitar riff. It's got, one of Johnny Cash's favorite couplets, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die," and the fact that he played it it got big at that live recording.
That's right.
I just love that.
Well, and my podcast partner told me that if we didn't put that on the final list, that our list was worthless. So I suppose that's required. Although I can make the argument, and I said this to you earlier, I can make the argument that was the second best prison song on that album. Because if you had an audience meter in that prison yard where he played, or whatever the auditorium was, the cafeteria or wherever it was, he was set up, and judged how well the audience reacted. The one that they reacted the biggest to by far was "Cocaine Blues." It was early one morning, I was making the rounds, took a shot of cocaine and shot my woman down. And it goes all the way to his death sentence, and of course he's in Folsom Prison while he waits to die. Also in that one, there's a Folsom reference playing in front of them. But obviously, in terms of broader popular love of the song and sort of in the pantheon of truly great prison songs, I think you're right. Folsom Prison Blues eclipses it. But it is funny to listen to it on that album. Yeah. The Prisoners probably wouldn't have picked it. They probably would have picked
my band, the Wild Seeds, used to play that song whenever we had to do 3-set nights. We would always pull out covers, and that was always one of them because it was so much fun to play.
Outstanding. Yes, I can hear him start it up just as you do that. Oh my God.
And then my fifth one is kind of a guilty pleasure, and it's, we were talking about authenticity. This is probably not the most authentic prison song, but "Jailhouse Rock" by Elvis is such a great song. I mean, and it's a great song for all kinds of reasons. I mean, the whole way that song is structured with the intro, which was just so cool. Da-dum, da-dum. And then just the guitar solo, the guitar sound, the way Elvis sings it. It's just this perfect little pop song that was written by two guys who probably never even went into a jail cell in their lives.
Right. They were writing like for a musical.
They were writing it for Elvis's his
movie.
The movie.
Right.
And then it comes out in that movie with all that choreography, and it's just, even though it's like so Hollywood phony, it's so cool. I love that song.
The choreography was amazing in that scene. I'll tell you, I wouldn't even think it should be considered for the top 5 if it weren't for that movie scene. The choreography in that scene was so amazing. And then the other thing that happens in that song and in that scene is, of course, it's this great dance scene and this great dance number. And about halfway through the song, you realize, wait, it's all men.
It's all men.
There's one line in the song that actually makes that explicit. And
you're the cutest jailbird I ever did see.
That's right.
All right.
And so, that as far as like super popular American songs, that's a pretty early reference there. So I definitely think the movie and the choreography in that scene made it, one that definitely deserves consideration.
The truth is, you can't just do prison songs that are downers. Prison is a terrible downer. I've never been in prison, but I can't imagine a worse downer. And yet you got to have some songs that are, uppers.
That's right. Well, I've said on my list of 30 because I was way too lazy to narrow it down to 5. So I started looking at it. But one of them I had on there was Merle Haggard's I Made the Prison Band. So, there's things that happen that are not all downers. Yeah. But I don't think that actually would make it into the 5. He has 2 others at least that would probably be ahead.
Well, yeah, Sing Me Back Home is a real downer. I mean, in a lot of these songs, the guy is about to die. That's
right. Well, Mama Tried is probably the greatest of those 3.
Yeah.
And it's, I guess, a downer too. It's certainly got a jamming beat to it, but
yeah.
I turned 21 in prison doing life without parole. Yikes.
Yeah. That's a downer.
That's a downer. So I'll grant you we need to find some upbeat ones, although that's a hard one, man. That's a tough call. Now, you and I both are more likely to look at sort of the folk and blues. There are absolutely some hip hop tunes that are friggin' badass and probably deserve serious consideration. I think the one that for me is the most impactful was Public Enemy's Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos. It opens with this absolutely amazing scene of this guy sitting in prison and getting his draft notice. And he says, I learned something today when I got this notice from the government. They're a bunch of suckers. That's not, that's a paraphrase, but that's essentially the sentiment. And he goes, and the whole thing is a meditation with him sitting staring at this draft notice.
That's great.
And thinking about, the role of the black man in America. And wow, it's just a heavy hitting, very impactful piece. Similarly, although, incredibly dark again, but Ludacris's Do Your Time, don't let your time do you, man. But
great line.
And, became sort of really part of the popular culture, that line. One of them that, again, probably isn't going to get up to the top 5, but Ice-T's The Tower is quite a song from now, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Where he's walking into the prison yard for the first time and trying to figure out who has the power in the prison yard. Is it the white gang, is it the black gang, or is it the guards in the tower? But let's see, a few others that I had on here that probably are worth considering as we rank. Hurricane by Bob Dylan. You had mentioned, you've wondered actually if Hurricane was actually innocent. To me, that was the greatest song ever written about an innocence case, and now you've totally dashed my...
Well, see, I remember hearing that on the radio when I was a teenager, and for one thing, it was a long song.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it was a long song, that it was a hit, but also it was a prisoner song, and it's a great song.
It really is.
The melody of it, the way Dylan and his co-writer on that one, put together this story, this long story with a great chorus, with the fiddle breaks on it. It's so cool. It's got all these memorable lines. But yes, a few years ago, I actually went down this rabbit hole on the internet from some people who said this was Dylan's worst song because, in fact, Hurricane Carter was guilty. I have no idea if he was or not, but I just remember thinking, okay, this is not one of those open shut cases.
Right. Well, and I have not gone down that rabbit hole. It will greatly disappoint me if that turns out to be the case. But hey, that was a long time ago now, and it's still a great song. Let's see a few others I had on my list. One that you hadn't heard before, but was "The Warden" by the Old Crow Medicine Show.
That's
Again,
cool.
It's a cool song. It doesn't have the sort of great historical impact that we're looking for, I think, in the Great American Prison Song. But boy, is that a good song. One you and I both remembered from the 70s was "Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree." It's funny to think about that song now, that this song about a prisoner coming home, I'm coming home, I've done my time. Now I've got to know what is and isn't mine.
And it's a song that the songwriter wrote based on a true story.
Right.
Kind of gives it a little bit of oomph.
Gives it an authenticity push. It does.
It's a corny song.
The Tony Orlando and Dawn singing it gives it an authenticity decrease.
but it all evens out.
That's right. Let's see. I would say Jimmy Rogers in the Jailhouse now in the country music world sure would be right up there. Sure. Also, one that won't make the top 5, but that was a fine song by an ex-prisoner who was kind of a badass, is David Allan Coe's "Prisoner Song." Yeah. And he was quite a piece of work himself. Yeah, I think those are the ones I had that probably really justify the list. Let's see. "I Fought the Law" was the other one that I thought, man, that's borderline, but wow, what a great song.
It's another great pop song. Sonny Curtis wrote it. I read where he described writing it. It was one of those songs that just popped out. And those are the best songs. He wrote it in 5 minutes, just staring out of the West Texas landscape one day, breaking rocks in the hot sun. It came to him. I fought the law, and the law won. I don't think Sonny Curtis ever did a day of time, but boy, that song's great. And in particular, as it's been covered by so many people over the years.
Right. Well, it was recorded by the Crickets, which gives it a great Texas connection. And then the version by the Clash, to me, took it from a really good song to a completely iconic song.
Yeah. That made the Clash. I mean, that was their first huge hit.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, man, it absolutely just turned that into something that was almost a national sentiment.
Yeah.
In many ways. So, all right. Well, with that presentation of our possibilities there, what do we think are in the top 5? It seems like we've automatically got Midnight Special, Folsom Prison Blues are in both our top lists.
Absolutely.
What else do we think among these we've talked about? Yours?
I mean, for me, I would definitely put "Ain't No More Cane" on there just because it is like one of the earliest. And I mean, you can't listen to that original version without feeling it. I mean, it's just an amazing song.
It is an amazing,
and it's very Texas.
Well, if anyone detects a Texan bias on this podcast, you're tuning in for the first time. Clearly. Let's see.
I mean, I had "I Shall Be Released," which is, I really like that song, but what pushes it over the edge is Nina Simone's version of it.
I can see that. I think of the ones that I had been raising. I really do think that Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos probably deserves to be on there, if only so we can have a little diversity.
Absolutely.
In the music genre. And let's see, if I were rounding out a top 5, man, and your last one was Jailhouse Rock. Wow, that's both tough to argue and tough to agree with.
Well, you might want to put a pop song on there and just kind of the opposite on the authenticity meter, but a song that would really draw people in. And if it wasn't that, maybe it is "Chain Gang" by Sam Cooke, or
that's right.
I mean, maybe it's "I Fought the Law," which was originally written as a pop song.
Exactly. Or actually, there's no "Back on the Chain Gang" by the Pretenders went to a big thing on the.
That's true.
On the pop charts. I don't think it would get into the greatest prison song list, but it's funny that a few, do.
I think you could. I mean, on any of those, if you wanted to do, sometimes you have to figure out not just diversity. I mean, there are all kinds of diversity issues, and that's a pop diversity issue. So I think any one of those songs is a great song.
And of those, Elvis is just too iconic to ignore. I think you're probably right. The Jailhouse Rock has to be the final. And now with that pronouncement, I think, the world can rest easy knowing that, this ranking has been established.
Top 5.
The top 5 have been established. And actually, I will go through and make a YouTube playlist of all of the songs that we named here on the podcast today for anyone who's interested. And we'll publish that when we publish the podcast. So, Mike, thanks a lot for talking with me.
Thanks, Scott. This has been great.
It has.
The incarceration train keeps rolling, rolling down the line. It's filled with pain and sorrow, but the driver, he's doing just fine. Just fine. And the passengers in cargo, when they get to the end of the line, gonna learn this train went nowhere, Lord, and the ticket price sure is high. Stop the train.
Stop the train.
Stop the train.
Stop the train.
Stop the train, I'm getting off. The train pulls into the station when the driver blows his horn. My baby will be there waiting, Lord, just as sure as the day you were born. And the doors of the train will open, and the platform people will flood. And a voice will ring from heaven saying your debt was paid with blood. Stop the train. Stop the train. Stop the train.
Stop the train.
Stop the train, I'm getting old. Stop the train.
Stop the train.
Stop the train.
Stop the train.
Stop the train, I'm getting old.
Now it's time for our rapid fire segment we call the Last Hurrah. Mandy, are you ready?
I'm ready to go. First up, earlier this year, the chief of intelligence at the Texas Department of Public Safety briefed President Donald Trump about alleged rapists among Mexican migrants at the border. Now the same man has been arrested and charged for allegedly raping a woman in Austin. Scott, what are the implications here?
Well, if it's true, obviously, it's this unbelievable irony and just almost an absurd level of irony if these allegations are accurate. But beyond that, this man was in charge of all of the state's fusion centers that gathered intelligence on every Texan, that gathered video from thousands and thousands of surveillance cameras, that had access to intimate location information details. The idea that if this type of person was in charge of all those resources, it wasn't being abused would be pretty naive. So this is a scandal because of the profound hypocrisy on the one hand, but the rabbit hole may go a lot deeper than that.
Oh, let's hope not.
After an abysmal 86 Texas legislative session in which scarce little reform legislation passed on criminal justice beyond abolition of the driver responsibility surcharge, 10 legislators have created a bipartisan criminal justice reform caucus to try to do better next time. Mandy, is this significant?
Yes. What we saw this past session, especially in the House where this caucus is really focused, was a lot of misinformation about criminal justice reforms and people not understanding the implications of what they were voting for. So if you create a caucus that establishes themselves as being sort of the go-to people on these issues within both parties, I think that would go a long way to passing bills on the floor. Finally, Harris County has settled the lawsuit over its misdemeanor bail practices, establishing rules that mean 85% of misdemeanor defendants will go free without being required to post bond. Scott, is this the end of the story or just the next phase?
Well, it's the end of a very long chapter for sure for Harris County. Although this only affects misdemeanor cases, there's still an outstanding case in Harris County on felony cases, felony bail. And other counties in Dallas and Galveston and elsewhere are also being sued. Eventually, where this is all going to end up is in the federal courts. And one of these cases is eventually going to be the source of a decision from either the Fifth Circuit or the Supreme Court. And that'll establish rules for the entire state. So for Harris County, it's the end of an incredibly expensive chapter. Millions of dollars were spent on this lawsuit. For the rest of the state, there's still a long way to go. All right, we're out of time, but we'll try and do better the next time. Until then, I'm Scott Henson with Just Liberty.
And I'm Amanda Marzullo with the Texas Defender Service. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.
You can subscribe to the Reasonably Suspicious podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or SoundCloud, or listen to it on my blog, Grits for Breakfast. We'll be back next month with more and hopefully better news. And until then, keep fighting for criminal justice reform. It's the only way it's going to happen.
Well, you can't get blood from a stone, they say. And that's why my traffic tickets I didn't pay. I threw them away. I put them out of my mind till I saw the red and blue in my mirror behind me. I told him, sir, I'm headed to work, while he twisted my arm till the socket hurt. He said, not today, cause you didn't pay. Gonna handcuff you and take you away. Oh, I'm jailbound, baby, ain't got nothing left to lose. Cause I had traffic tickets, baby, now I got those debtor's prison blues. Judge wants the money, but it's already spent. If I had that much money, man, I'd pay them damn rent. I lost my job, couldn't make it to work. I left my little girl at school sitting on the curb. The rent is late, the bills are due. I don't know what I'm gonna do. Ooh, yeah. Cause I'm jailbound, baby, ain't got nothing left to lose. Cause I had traffic tickets, baby, and now I got those debtor's prison blues. And now I got those debtor's prison blues.
You got bad choices, whatever.